You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, a show that uncovers what's fact, what's fake, and what's fun in the crazy world of pseudo-archaeology. Hello and welcome to the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, episode 169. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, and tonight, the Shroud of Turin. And if you're thinking, wait, hasn't he already gone over the Shroud of Turin? Yes, he has, twice before. What's going on? It was on Piers Morgan Uncensored, so we got to talk about it. Well, hello and welcome back, friends. And as you heard correctly in the intro, we are doing the Shroud of Turin. And I know you're like, what? Didn't you? It's like, not only, Kinkella, did you do sort of a general Shroud of Turin, like, I don't know, 2 years ago or something. You did an update on the Shroud of Turin pretty recently. Like, what gives? And this is the deal, my friends. You're going to go through this pain with me because this is yet another example of things that never die. And the Shroud of Turin just never dies. It might go to sleep a little while. It might take a hiatus. It might have a vacation, but it's always here. So, you know, it's funny for me. It's like when I see something new on the Shroud, I go, oh boy, the Shroud. But it also just, it's like, okay, it's another time to deal with this. And of everything we've talked about on this podcast, this is the first time that I've talked about something for the third time, if that makes sense. And it's even rare for me to talk about stuff 2 times, you know? Because I do try and be like creative. I always try and do something different. And ultimately, it has to be fun for me. You know, like it can't be something that's torturous for me to talk about or something like that. It's got to have its own fun. It's got to have its own joy. And so while I might be on one hand a little tired of the Shroud or a little sick of it, on the flip side, what was nice was I learned 1 or 2 more things about the Shroud, and I think it made me able to describe the entire story of the Shroud a bit better. And because the Shroud, as we know, it's one of those things that has been talked about and gone over, and there's just so much BS in the world about the frickin' Shroud. You know what I mean? And what's sad, and this happens with all famous things, whether it be King Tut, whether it be Stonehenge, whether it be the Shroud of Turin, it's just super hard to find the reality. You know, I'm sure you agree with me when you're just like, man, I just want to know the truth. Like, what's the factual truth about this? Like, no political machinations, no story that must be true. It's just, what's the setup? What's the deal? So I'm here to give that to you. Okay. That's always what I want to do with this stuff. It's like, I want to just roll it out. And even for me, it's so hard to find real data. I think 1 or 2 things I've said in the past were a little bit wrong. And they weren't crazy wrong. They were just certain things about how the Shroud was originally made that I was like 8% off on, you know, and it already gets into people who believe in the Shroud. As soon as I say something honest, like, oh, of these 16 points, I did get point number 12 a little bit wrong. They go, oh, see, he's wrong. It's like, I'm not wrong. I'm just being honest and I'm learning and I'm trying to get this right. So again, why am I talking about this? Well, because the Shroud is in the news again. Okay, where is it in the news? It was on Piers Morgan Uncensored a couple days ago. I like Piers Morgan Uncensored. I like that show overall. It is, of course, 10% silly. It is, of course, 10%, over the top. It is 10% like the same as a talk show that would have been on in 1994, where they put people on there where you're watching for the train wreck, you're watching for the strife, you're watching for the over the top aspect. Sure, we all get that, but it still has its own interest. And I do think Piers Morgan is a good host, and sort of he does have that ability to get each person talking and give them their time and this kind of thing. So who's on this one? Well, of course, Piers introduces it. And of course, for the clickbait title, if you go on YouTube, the title is simply Beyond All Doubt, Jesus. That's it, right? And then there's a little more to the title where it says, Experts Debate Shroud of Turin with Piers Morgan. Okay, whatever. The term experts is a little bit of a stretchy stretch. And it's one of those things. There are some people on there who actually, they are experts in their own way, but whatever. So who's on there? Well, if you're a fan of the Piers Morgan show, or you know how this goes, Piers just sort of starts this roundtable debate, and it's basically a Zoom debate almost as you watch it. Each person is a little square on the screen. And in this episode, they have, the first guy is Jeremiah Johnston. He is from the Christian Thinkers Society. I know, so easy to make fun of. I'm just going to chill. So, and Jeremiah Johnston, from what I've looked at, does have real degrees and stuff. I think he does have a PhD, and he has done a deep dive academically into the Shroud and into sort of, the resurrection in general and this kind of thing. So he is a Christian scholar to a degree. Absolutely. That's cool. So he's on there. And then they have Joseph, I think his last name is Aseta. If you look back on the Shroud episodes I did earlier, I talked about this. He was part of that original 1978 team. The original, I believe it's called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or Shroud of Turin Research Program. It's STRP. He was a member of the original 1978 STRP team, which has its own interest. So he's there. He's obviously, an older guy, but I think he kind of provides the sort of voice of reason to a degree. I think he was actually almost too nice to some of the pseudoscience aspects of it, but whatever. And then finally, you have this guy named Seth Andrews, who comes on late. And this is the structure often of the Piers Morgan show, where they have a couple people debate, and then they have like an extra person they throw in at like the, 35-minute mark or something. The Piers Morgan show is organized time-wise. It's like about an hour long, sometimes a bit less. I think maybe sometimes it runs a bit more, but it's in that world, and it does cook along. I think this one, I can look it up right now. Yeah, this one was like 43 minutes long or so. So that's, that I will give them this in 43 minutes. It keeps your interest. It keeps cooking along. So again, good for him. Good for Piers Morgan. Good for Piers Morgan Uncensored. The show works and does what it's supposed to do. So, and this final guy, Seth Andrews, of course, again, is from The Thinking Atheist. I think that's his moniker. That's his handle. All right. So really, they talk to, of course, Jeremiah Johnston the most. And as a part of the Christian Thinkers Society, what side do you think he's on, right? He says that the Shroud is real. It's Jesus's actual covering. And look, the idea that this is the actual cloth used at the time of the death of Jesus is ludicrous. We have to keep that in mind. There is no evidence for this. Again, he brings up what you can call quote unquote evidence, but it's not. It's terrible evidence. It's weak evidence. This is something where he's just not following the facts. He's not allowing the facts to speak. And so because of that, he has to commit a bunch of logical fallacies. He has to do a bit of almost sleight of hand. And it's really a bummer because, look, I have nothing against somebody doing a deep dive and learning about like ancient Christianity or something. I mean, dude, I'm an archaeologist. Like, I want to hear from people who know a lot about that. I don't know a lot about that. And I don't say that as some weird point of pride. Being ignorant is never a point of pride. I don't like it that I'm vaguely ignorant on some of the like old world, like Eastern Mediterranean stuff from that time. Again, you can only specialize in so much stuff, but that's something that I know a bit less of. I do know the story of the Shroud pretty well at this point. But they talk to this guy first, and he starts with, this is, quote, the most lied about artifact ever. It's like, no, it's not. Get in line. First, it's not, if anyone's doing the lying, it's actually him. And I don't take fun or take pride in calling somebody a liar. I'm not angry. I'm not like Jeremiah Johnston, liar. Right. It's not like that. I'm like, dude, come on. We need to be realistic. And what's funny with him too, is he talks about, we need the latest science. And then he just doesn't use the latest science, and he denies the latest science. When he says quotes like, we need the latest science, what he means is, we need people to agree with me. Because they don't. And he sells the thing that the last guy sold in my last podcast. I can't believe he does this. He sells the resurrection of Jesus as a radiation event. Oh, Lord. Oh, wait, let's say the correct thing. Oh, Jesus. Right? It's a radiate. Come. As soon as you say that, I'm like, I'm done. I'm like, dude, stop. First, at least, date the shroud to the time, which they don't. Their facts and their evidence are terrible. And again, I would go with you. What's so funny is, they often say like, oh, archaeologists, they won't listen. If you have decent data, I'll listen to you tomorrow. If tomorrow something came out and showed like, oh, the Shroud of Turin really is like from about the time of Jesus. Let's not even bother with, is it actually Jesus or not? If you showed me some good data that dates this to around the time of Christ, I'm all in, man. I'm all in tomorrow. But you don't got it. So we can start with the dates. Oh, another thing he says is like, we have to get to the truth, right? Not only do we need scientific studies, we need to get to the truth, otherwise known as the truth being when people agree with me and tell me I'm right. It's like, stop it, dude. This is so much the same. I mean, these lines, just put them in Graham Hancock's mouth, like use any pseudoscientist. They all tell the same stuff. They all use the same lines. They paint themselves as these warriors, being downtrodden when they need to get to the truth. It's like the truth is staring you right in front of your face. You're just not accepting it. In all this, as we're talking about, the truth and the dating and all that kind of stuff, there was a paper that recently came out, and I think this is what ignited the Shroud of Turin yet again, I think, is the reaction to this. There was this guy named Cicero Moraeus, and he wrote this recent 2025 paper in Archaeology. Archaeology is a very academic kind of journal on archaeology, right? This is archaeometry, like measurements in archaeology, measuring dates. It's very sciencey. It's very, in some ways, very dull, but very sciencey. And he's a Brazilian, basically 3D designer guy. So he's not really an academic archaeologist, which in this case is actually really great because his specialty is in like dealing with the three-dimensional designs and this kind of stuff. So he basically takes a look at the shroud and specifically how the shroud was produced and shows that like, no, it wasn't produced by being a burial shroud on a three-dimensional human, right? He's all about three-dimensionals stuff. That's his specialty. He's like, this cloth was not put on a three-dimensional person. It had to have been put on basically a low, how do I explain this? Like a stamp of a human. And you're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, a stamp of a human, meaning a low relief carving of a human. Think of how you make a stamp. Think about how in the first grade, you took a potato and cut it in half. At least we of Gen X did. And you cut like an image, even something as simple as an X, in the potato. And then you put the potato in ink and then you can stamp out a bunch of X's, right? It's the same thing, but either carved out of stone or most likely like made out of wood. You make basically a life-size human stamp and then you put ink on it and then you put the shroud on it. That's how it was done. When I talked about this last time, I talked more about a bas relief. And I think the idea of like a stamp is even better than a bas relief because, I mean, a bas relief is still low, it's low relief. It's still low relief. But I think this is the part where I was like, I think I was a bit wrong, because according to Moraeus, he's like, look, if you take ink and put it on a full 3-dimensional human and put the shroud on and then lift the shroud off, you get what's called the Agamemnon effect. And this is an archaeology term. This goes with the gold death mask of Agamemnon, which many of you have probably seen. It's not really Agamemnon, but it's from the time. It was found by Heinrich Schliemann, excavating in Troy in the 1870s. But if any of you have seen that gold death mask, it's really stretched out. It's really stretched out wide, right? It makes the face look super wide. That's what happens if you're an actual human and you have a burial shroud on and you're covered in ink. You take the shroud off and it's stretched out, like when it's taking something from 3 dimensions, putting it into 2 dimensions. Does that make sense? You have so picture a sheet over your face, and then you have ink on your face. You impress the ink onto the shroud, onto the cloth, and then you take it off. It's going to be like too long, right? That's why. And Cicero Moraeus does a great job. He did a little YouTube video where he actually put ink on his face and then put like a paper towel on it and then took the paper towel off, and it's way too long. It doesn't look human, right? It looks stretched out. So if this was actually the shroud of Jesus and Jesus actually had a radiation event burning himself into the shroud, you would have the Agamemnon effect. It would look all stretched out, and it just doesn't. Thank you, Cicero Moraeus. Done. Voted. Done. Nothing else to say. Such a great job. I love stuff like that. Anyway, when we return, the reasons why people who think this is the Shroud of Jesus get angry when you show them facts like this. Hello, and welcome back to the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, episode 169. Ha! And we are talking about the Shroud of Turin, specifically because it was on Piers Morgan Uncensored. And we had just talked about how this guy, Cicero Moraeus, a 3D designer expert, had just done this sort of takedown of all the silliness surrounding the Shroud of Turin and showing that no matter how old it is, no matter what you think, that this shroud was not made on a 3-dimensional person because it just would not work whatsoever. And of course, to go onward onto the actual image, the image has like one arm that's longer than the other. The image is of a 6-foot tall man, where you're like, you think Jesus was 6 feet tall? What are the chances? I'll tell you. Let's go with slim to none. But, you know, that's pretty brutal. And I noticed this goes by fast in the YouTube video. But Pierce asks Jeremiah Johnson about that. He's like, hey, what about that this man on the image is 6 feet tall? Jeremiah Johnson doesn't talk about that at all. And instead, he has a spike from the Mediterranean world, just a spike, you know, but he literally busts it out right then and goes, look at this spike. Total like basic magician sleight of hand 101. It's like, take their attention over to this spike. Look at the spike. He never addressed, you know, the fact that the Shroud of Turin is of a 6 foot tall man. He just goes, look at this spike. I thought that was weird. It's a non sequitur. It's like, look at this artifact. And me being an archaeologist, I'm like, spiking a spike anywhere. I'll get you a spike by lunchtime today. You know, it was just sort of I don't even know if it's a full on red herring. I'm sure he had it there to say, he was trying to drive home the point that, you know, Jesus was crucified, I guess. But it ended up being a great example of just like shifting the audience's attention and never answering a really important fact, which is like, was Jesus 6 feet tall? Because he had to have been if this was his actual shroud. Back to the dating. So people bitch and moan about carbon-14 dating of the Shroud of Turin. And as you've heard me say in the past, because I've actually prepped samples and I've done all that stuff, I know carbon-14 well. Trust your carbon-14 dates. The chances of them being bad somehow, you know, contaminated somehow, is really quite low. I don't think I've ever had a contaminated sample. The problem was my contaminated brain. And again, what I mean by that is that I wasn't ready to accept the dates, right? Happens to all of us. And so you always want to be pragmatic and be like, oh, maybe these dates could be, maybe there could be something wrong. But I thought that Joseph Aceta, who is the original older man who worked on the original 1978 project, I thought he brought up a great point. Again, he was very open to that. He was very much like, hey, the carbon-14 dates could be from this different part of the shroud, which I always thought this is a terrible argument. But, the idea that all the carbon-14 dates were taken from a piece of the shroud that was part of a fix on the shroud. And again, the carbon-14 dates they read at about 1300 AD. Making the shroud 1,300 years too old, or too new, rather. The shroud being, way too new, because it's a forgery from the 1300s. I thought he made a really great point because he went through being like, hey, look, carbon-14 dates can be wrong. This could be the wrong power of the shroud, whatever. This could be contaminated. But then he said, isn't it interesting that if these samples are indeed contaminated, that the contamination made the dates come out to exactly when the forgery would have occurred, to exactly when historically we know these forgeries were occurring, to exactly when we historically know that the shroud makes its first appearance. I thought that was an excellent point. I'd never really thought of it that way before, where it's like, sure, the dates could be contaminated, but they date to exactly when the historic records do. They agree with the historic records. What are the chances of that? Let me tell you, that is a 1 in a billion kind of thing. That is not going to happen. So a fantastic point. It's like, yeah, it dates to the 1300s, dude. Then Jeremiah Johnson also takes this moment and says well, there's this other dating method, the Waxis scan, that dates it to the time of Christ. And this, you guys, I think is the worst part about being a sort of pseudo-archaeology mythbuster like I am. It's having to look up all this crap. And what happens is pseudo-archaeologists just make stuff up. And they also cherry pick, right? That's another logical fallacy. You just cherry pick. You just take the 2 data points that agree with you and ignore the other 4,000. But I'm always like, oh, God, I got to look that up just to see if there's any reality. I looked up what a Waxis scan is, WAXS. It stands for Wide Angle X-ray Scan, I believe. And this is non-invasive, meaning you don't have to burn up or mess up the thing that you're dating. You just do the scan on it, but it's not really even used as a dating method. I looked into it and I'm like, oh, damn it. It does a real thing. This is a real scientific thing. It looks at organic material and how the cellulose in it degrades over time. So you do the scan and you can tell basically how degraded it is from when it was pristine. Okay. And I'm making this up, but let's say you get a reading and you go, oh, it's 50% degraded, then you can make some sort of guess of age, but I think they use it for other things. I think what they care about when they're using this is the degradation itself. I don't think they care about the age of things. This is used in a different manner. But the idea of using it as a dating method is it sounds like it's really silly. You can't even really find real scientific studies on using this to date stuff. They don't, because if you're looking at, you guys can figure this out. If you're looking at a piece of cloth made from organic material, stuff that was once living from plants or whatever, and it's degraded, okay, it's degraded, but how long did it take to degrade? Well, that depends. It depends on the environment it was in. Was it stored well? Was it in a place where it got really hot, really cold? Did it get wet? Did it rot? It's like you keep a piece of linen like that in the jungle, it's gone to nothing in 2 weeks. So versus if you keep it in the tomb with King Tut, it still looks pretty damn good 3,000 years later. So you see, it measures the amount of degradation just fine, but how long it took, it doesn't work at all. I think it's completely fine to look at something like this and look further into what kind of dating you might be able to do. But it sounds really crappy to me in terms of its dating abilities. And in all this, we have to always remember that carbon-14 is miles better than something like this. This is just a pointless waste of time. And of course, see, according to the Wax's scan, it dates to around the time of Christ. What do you mean? They could use the equivalent of the method that I just invented off the top of my head, the look at it method, the LAI method, look at it, meaning look at the linen and tell me how old it looks. Seriously, you guys, that's what this is. This is often something that pseudoscience does. They take something scientific, so it gives them some sort of feeling like they actually have some sort of gravity or weight in what they're saying, but then they bastardize it and make it make no sense. And it always sounds sciencey. We did the Wax's scan. The Wax's scan. It's like, yeah, but it didn't. Who cares? Waste of time. So moving on. Everything still dates to the 13. What's funny is as I see stuff like this, at the end, I'm always like, oh, I was even more right than I thought. Like, wow, the evidence points even more towards it being a fake. And I love, again, what Cicero Moraeus did with the like 3D idea of things. You guys can look it up on YouTube. It's hilarious because he's not there to make some huge point. He's just like, check this out. Look at this. Here, I'm going to ink my own face. I'm going to put a paper towel on it. Boom. This is what it looks like if you do this. Jeremiah Johnson will have quotes like he's constantly, after he does the Wax's scan stuff, he's like, we need the latest science. And then 2 seconds later, this is another quote. Well, you see, science can't replicate this. So he uses the pseudos, he in a pseudoscience way, he uses science when it works for him and then he doesn't when it doesn't. I will say this. As these guys talked, they were positive. They were generally nice. There wasn't huge name calling. Like, good for them. So Jeremiah Johnston, even though I disagree with you absolutely, and I find a bunch of the stuff you're pulling up like just not reasonable whatsoever and silly, he's a fair individual, like he did fine. They were all thoughtful of each other and just talked back and forth and were generally positive in the way they were doing things. Like, good for them. I like it when it's like that. I don't want to see like arguments and BS. Like, they did a great job. Okay. With that, you know what? Since I hit a high point, we're going to stop this and we're going to head on to segment 3. I'll see you guys in a second. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Pseudo Archaeology Podcast, episode 169. And we have been discussing the episode of Piers Morgan Uncensored, where they talk about the Shroud of Turin. And, I thought that, I believe it was Joseph Aceta, right, the older gentleman, who brought up a really important point on this. He really broke this down. Again, he was very thoughtful on this. And he's like, hey, no matter what, there's 4 things that you have to define or understand or prove when you're talking about the Shroud of Turin. First, you got to figure out how old it is, right? How old is it? And obviously all evidence points to it being about, from about 1300. But if you want it to be of the time of Jesus, you have to date it somehow to being at the point of Jesus. And there's no real evidence for that. Second, you have to connect it to Jesus somehow, meaning that like, okay, it's 2,000 years old. Now, is it actually in connection to the historical figure of Jesus somehow? And again, they can't. And that's really hard. I gotta feel for them there. But, that's almost impossible. I've seen, locally there, I live very close to the Reagan Library, and they recently did the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think they're still there, just barely. They're leaving soon. But they also had what they called, quote unquote, the Jesus boat. And they were honest about this, but just because you call it the Jesus boat, it doesn't mean Jesus was actually on the boat. And this was literally, a handful of wood that was from a boat from the time of Jesus. So they could fulfill step 1 and age how old it is. Yes, it was from the time of Jesus, but step 2, could they say that Jesus was there? No, not at all. It would be the equivalent of, yeah, Jesus was walking around there and Jesus might have seen this boat floating out in the harbor, but who knows? That's fine. So But in this case, was Jesus a part of the shroud? There's no way to say. 3, he said you have to illuminate a chain of custody. That I didn't really think of that. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. So it's like, if you're saying this is from the time of Jesus, well, where was it 300 years after Jesus? What about 500 years? What about 700 years? We need to at least try and figure out, okay, what's its timeline? And you just can't until it strangely shows up in the 1300s. Once you see it in the 1300s, then you establish chain of custody in the 1300s because it's a fake. Which, by the way, at the time they thought it was a fake too. I covered this previously in my previous podcast. At the time, they were like, "Oh yeah, this is a fake." It was like 100 years after the fake was made, where they were like, "Oh no, it could be real." It needed that patina of age. Anyway, so their chain of custody, there's just no chain of custody. And finally, he had this great point where he's like, look, and this is not in the Gospels. It's not recorded, and thus a shroud covered Jesus. It's like, no, it's not in the Gospels either. So just those points, and those are very neutral, scientific, hey, we're trying to get down to the bottom of this kind of points. And the shroud does not fulfill them whatsoever. Again, it was block printed, right? I love this idea because it just makes sense, right? Either it basically a very low relief, think of a 6 foot long, like kind of carved out of wood stamp. And that's why I think I was vague on this in the past. I didn't say this perfectly, but in terms of it not being painted, it's true. It's not painted, meaning by a paintbrush. There are no brush strokes, right? So that's because it's stamped. It's one big, huge stamp. You put all the ink on the stamp and then you put the shroud over it and the ink just bleeds in, right? There are no brush strokes. So that makes total sense. So often people who believe in the shroud are like, but there are no brush strokes. It's like, yeah, there's no brush strokes when you stamp something. Second, with that, in terms of, the stamp and the ink, it was ink. And what's happened is the ink gets old over time and it's corroding the surface. That's what gives it its look, right? When stuff ages over the centuries, the ink can be acidic and sort of, eat away at the material it's on. And that's what you're seeing here. They're having difficulties sometimes protecting it, keeping it not protecting it, but keeping it from destroying itself. So many archaeological artifacts. This is just true. Love the shroud or hate the shroud. You want the shroud to be around. It's interesting. So when you take the shroud in that way and look at it like that, it answers everything. There's nothing left. This was a fake, done like 700 years ago at a time when many fakes were being made, done using ink. And in terms of what this ink was totally in the ink, they argued as being, I think, called iron gall ink or this kind of thing. I've also heard this called other things, but we want to know, obviously, but however it goes, it's this kind of thing. Like, what's the ink composed of, right? But that's how it's made. It makes such sense. There you go. It's why it has that negative image look. It's perfect. It answers everything. To that, Jeremiah Johnson was like, well, then he had to start throwing out a lot of just sort of logical fallacies. His quotes like, Jesus Christ's historical record is so clear. No, it's not. It's not. It is absolutely unclear if Jesus was a historical figure or not. If we're honest, there is no direct evidence that Jesus was a historical figure. And I got nothing against Jesus, if that makes sense. But if I'm sitting here as a real archaeologist, no, I have to tell you, Jesus can be a purely fictional character used in the Bible. That is a possibility. So we just have to know that there's just not, evidence is so sparse on any of that kind of stuff. So, he says there's great evidence for this. It's like, no, there's not. Yeah. Okay. Where's that? And then, of course, he would just replay all this crap. Oh, the wax is skin. And then, of course, he angles towards his book. Well, you can look in my book. I don't mind that. He does a little plug for himself. That's fine. Dear Jeremiah Johnson. No big deal, dude. We all do it. It's part of living in the real world. And then he does use a bold logical fallacy that is often called, it's a name I hate. It's called the no true Scotsman logical fallacy, which is a purity play, which it really is, which is, he says, quote, "No serious scholar questions this." Yes, we do. And we don't really question it as much as we're like, it's a fake. So that idea, meaning, if you're questioning this, you're not a serious scholar, because virtuous, pure scholars, they don't question this. Yes, they do. It's a logical fallacy and a lie, right? So many logical fallacies are lie-ish. He then, at the end, he makes like an AI image of Jesus from the shroud. And that part's like really funny, because there's nothing wrong with making an AI image of this, but you're making an AI image based on a fake. So the whole thing is a waste of time, right? It's how often have you guys heard me say that? Again, in pseudo-archaeology, and the whole thing's a waste of time. Because it just is. And that's the only way, that's the only place he can go, because it's things like, I can't answer your question, but look at my AI image of Jesus. Well, the 6 feet tall thing, I don't know about that, but check out this spike. It's pointy. There you go. Seth Andrews, who was the thinking atheist guy, kind of comes in the end and just sort of chimes in a lot of stuff that I've already said. But that's what we got, man. That's where we're at. That's how Piers Morgan's show went. And obviously, even though I know that the Shroud of Turin is a fake because of the overwhelming scientific evidence, I appreciate that they talked about it. Sometimes I think you might get certain real archaeologists who'd be like, how dare they bring this up? But I'm like, keeps it in the spotlight, even though on the surface, when I see another thing about the shroud, I'm like, oh. But anything that keeps archaeology alive in the public mind, there's plenty of people who would see this and maybe go, oh, the shroud, yeah, whatever. But then it might make them do a deep dive into the shroud. Then they're into like history at the time. Then maybe they get into Egypt, and they move onward. So if Piers Morgan's show on the Shroud of Turin got you into serious archaeology, Piers, you did a good thing. And thank you for coming into archaeology, whoever it may be. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast. Please like and subscribe wherever you like and subscribe. And if you have questions for me, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, feel free to reach out using the links below or go to my YouTube channel, Kinkella Teaches Archaeology. See you guys next time.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.